What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of One on One with me, Dr. Akash Bajaj. Now, today's episode is one that I've been very excited about because we're talking about something that matters to every single one of us: how to age better, not just longer. So, joining me today in this discussion is Dr. Doug Lucas. He's a physician who specializes in healthspan, bone health, and hormone optimization. His work is changing the way that we think about aging, from performance and prevention to how we can take control of our long-term health through smarter, more personalized strategies. Now, this conversation dives into the new blueprint for aging and aging well, backed by science, driven by data, and designed to help you live stronger for longer. So if you're ready to finally shift from reactive care to proactive longevity, you're in the right place. But before we start, don't forget to hit the notification bell and subscribe so you never miss an episode of our show. Now let's get into it. Let's chat, bro. First and foremost, thanks for making the time to do this,
Yeah.
given the incredible, natural disasters that I'm sure you're directly being affected by. So I greatly appreciate it, man. I want to make sure
Yeah.
that my viewers also understand you're making the time for them. So thank you for them as well.
Yeah. No, I'm absolutely happy to do it. I think educating and delivering the message is one of the most important things that I do. So,
Well, yeah, like we were just briefly talking about, and I want to kind of maybe start with this. You have a kind of an interesting story going from traditional medicine, maybe we'll call it 2.0, to
yeah.
where you're at now. Can you give us all, and maybe give me just a little bit of an idea of, I guess, what sparked you to kind of make that change? Maybe what took you into orthopedics initially, and how and why you made this shift. I'm really curious about that.
Yeah. So I have kind of an interesting background that probably goes back even further than what you and I have talked about in the past. So my background actually goes pre-med school, even pre-first career, because I'm really in my, I don't know, third career probably at this point.
Wow.
I was raised in a family of like a medical family. My dad was a cardiothoracic surgeon. My mom was a nurse. I was just like raised in the environment. Like all of my parents' friends were doctors. And so it was just like that environment, right? And
Right.
it was an interesting time in medicine where my dad, as a surgeon in the field of basically heart transplant, learning how to do all these amazing life-saving things. It was very enchanting. We'll talk about being disenchanted, but it was very enchanting, right? They were doing amazing stuff. It sounded just phenomenal. And then
Right.
when I went into college, I sort of got, I don't want to say I lost track of it. I didn't want to pursue it, mostly because my dad was having a very terrible time in practice.
Okay.
Small solo private practice, taking call at I don't know how many hospitals in Kentucky and Indiana, and his lifestyle was terrible, absolutely terrible. And so I didn't really want that, and he really pushed me away from it. And then I went down kind of an interesting pathway where I ended up in the fine arts. I danced ballet professionally for a couple of years before going back to school. So I had this interesting turn where I was exposed to a totally different world. I was exposed to a world of a world of, unfortunately, of poverty in the fine arts, which is it was an interesting spin on that. But what it also exposed me to was the beauty of the musculoskeletal system, right? Like if you watch any athlete really, but dancers really seem to embody it because you can see everything working. You can see how when you align everything correctly,
Yeah.
it's a work of art. And so went down that pathway, got out of it because it's a very difficult way to make a living, and pursued going back to school. I initially started with physical therapy because I thought that would be a cool way to put it together, and then realized that wasn't right for me. And then I took the MCATs and went to med school. My initial thought there, I went to a DO program intentionally because I wanted to learn musculoskeletal manipulation. I thought that was a really cool way to engage with the muscles and with the skeleton. But then I got into the operating room for the first time on a rotation, and I just fell in love with it. I was like, man, this is powerful. There's
Yeah.
so much power to be able to open the skin, make a cut, do something very intentionally, and very directly make an outcome. So I just fell in love with it, and then I pursued it, and I love a challenge, and it's one of the hardest fields to get into. So we just power drove through that.
Nice.
Got into the residency and fellowship at Stanford and just felt great about it.
Awesome.
But then I
Awesome.
started practice. and and it's amazing in residency, like because you have such a short window, and I'm sure you experienced this too. It's a short window of um, you don't see the long-term outcomes. Generally, you see short-term outcomes. People are better, they get back to walking, or like whatever the immediate goal is. When you get into practice, you start finding the 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 10 year outcomes, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I realized very early on is that while we have a lot of power in the operating room, what we can't do is A, select our patients, but B, we really can't change the trajectory of chronic disease. We're just sort of making these micro tweaks, helping somebody to continue down the path that they're on, but the path that they're on is the problem. And so while we can do really powerful things, there is a much bigger picture to be addressed that our traditional medical system doesn't address well. So I was frustrated by my limited capacity really in the clinic, not so much in the operating room. And I was exposed to the power of alternative methods like nutrition, like lifestyle,
Yeah.
educating people that what we're being told by various government organizations, and really not influencers at the time, but the the messaging that was out there, the low fat diet, the so many of the things that were not serving people, that I wanted to help educate, but I couldn't figure out how to do it in practice. I couldn't figure out how to make it work because you as an anesthesiologist, me as a surgeon, we are widget doers, not really makers, right? We provide a service, a very specific service, and we have to get as many people through the clinic as possible, as many surgeries as possible, as much anesthesia as possible, right? Like we're just in that
Right.
machine. It's impossible to add nutrition to that. They're not there for that. I actually got told by one of my practices as I was trying to figure out where to live in medicine. I was told by one of the malpractice attorneys, like, "You're not trained in this. You can't talk about nutrition."
Whoa. No kidding.
Yeah, yeah. So that was part of the end of that job. But I realized very early on, man, I probably am going to end up doing something different. But it took a while to figure out how to do it, and then also
Yeah.
financially how to do it. Right? How do I
Sure.
exit this relatively high paying profession and still make my mortgage payments and support my family? And that was the challenge of what I had to figure out.
Yeah, it's interesting, man, and I can totally relate to a lot of what you said. People have this impression of us as physicians as like, we're just kind of rolling in financially just free, and we have all this kind of like liberty in that respect once you get through training. But very much like I learned when I set up my private practice, a lot of it then was more just like I got to pay the mortgage, I got to pay the rent, I got to see as many patients as possible, and what I call kind of like you know healthcare 2.0 or whatever we want to call it, the traditional
Yeah,
medical system here. The goal is not really to optimize your patients, as you know, so they don't have to come in reactively to get treated by you. There's no discussion of any sort of proactive treatment. It's more like, let's bang out as many patients as we can so we can just kind of keep moving forward. And it's like you're treading water the whole time.
yeah,
Meanwhile, your patients are just kind of getting sicker and sicker and sicker.
totally,
And I don't know about your experience, man, but it seems like the system is almost incentivized to have patients get sick. So
totally.
then they come see somebody like you and me.
Yeah, I was just having this conversation. Gosh, I was on a podcast. I forget even who it was with, but we were talking about like why surgeons don't talk about non-operative care as much as they
Yeah.
probably should, right? And it's like, well, look, how much do I get paid for a clinic visit where I'm talking somebody through non-operative care versus how much do I get paid to operate? And it is black and white, right? And
100%.
and while we as physicians should try to block that out, we are also then sitting in a business meeting looking at income and looking at which employees do we have to let go because we're not making enough money, which services do we have to stop offering because they're not profitable, and it is a business. So it is very difficult to protect those things. And then when you start saying, well, I want to add nutrition therapy, I want to add exercise training, you realize it doesn't pay. Not in the system, it doesn't pay.
Right.
So we are so disincentivized to do anything other than the widget or the service that we make and do. And that's I understand the way the system was built because it has to make money. All businesses have to make money unless they're funded by something else. But
Right.
it has become a massive machine with pharmaceutical industry and pay for service pathways. It's so challenging to do anything outside of, again, what you and I were trained to do in that system.
It's true, man. It's true. And I can only imagine how daunting that must have been, kind of moving out of that system to what you're doing now. And I understand what you're doing now obviously has a strong focus on maybe osteoporosis or health span. Like, give me an idea of how you got to where you're at now and then
Yeah.
how would
So
I
when
move
I
into
when I made the leap,
that?
I was able to kind of step out halfway out the door. So I left my private practice in Asheville. Um, and this was interesting timing right before the pandemic. So it was actually a good time to leave that practice because it became very hard to operate and do elective cases.
Right.
And so I went to work for the competing hospital system, and I had a non-compete. So I had to drive about 2 hours away to a hospital to actually practice. As a result of that, I only went out there twice a week. So the clinic was very grateful to have me. They didn't have an orthopedic surgeon. There were no services being provided in the area. So I was
Wow.
able to go out there. I had a day of clinic and a day at OR. I spent those other days and the drive time doing a fellowship through A4M and learning about functional medicine, learning about longevity, learning about like how can I really make the difference that I want to make for people. And it was awesome because I was able to continue to make money because they paid me, way more per hour to go out
Yeah.
there than I was making in Nashville. And so I was able to do that, get the education, and then I launched the company that we still have now called Optimal Human Health. Optimal Human Health, our goal was to essentially promote longevity, promote health span. I want you to live the best, longest life that you can, but in a healthy way.
Yeah.
And that was great. I really enjoyed doing that. And we started with a really small team. I was seeing all the patients. But the challenge that we have in that space, and it's gotten worse now over the last 4 years, 5 years, is that it's hard to attract an audience of healthy people. And so
Good
healthy
point.
people aren't looking for help, and also don't necessarily want to pay for it. So it's really hard to market to an audience of healthy people who want to perform better. And so that's why you see in the marketplace now, like when you go online and you search like, better energy, better sleep, like there are a bajillion offerings because everybody's trying to find a way to market to a healthy audience to help them feel better. So that was a challenge from a marketing perspective early on. And we were getting patients. My wife has a business and specializing in weight loss, and a lot of those clients would need support in either hormone support or thyroid support or gut health or whatever. So
Yeah.
we were getting patients through that avenue, but that was never going to be a sustainable lead source. The osteoporosis thing happened sort of, I don't know, I guess it was a message I kept getting. It was the universe, it was God, it was whatever. It just kept coming to me, falling in my lap, and finally I was like, okay, I get it. I get it. I'll build it. Right. So we had patients that kept coming. They'd have osteoporosis. They said, hey, do you think your approach can help? And I'd be like, I don't know. This isn't a bone health drug. I don't know what this is going to do. But the more I got into it, the more I realized, man, osteoporosis is it's a disease state that has a tremendous need as a community. Because the
Sure.
way I look at it now, now years later, I realize, man, osteoporosis shouldn't exist. Osteoporosis is a long-term imbalance of bone metabolism that can not only be reversed, well, I shouldn't say that, it can not only be prevented, it can be reversed even in the short term, like 1 to 2 years for people that have osteoporosis, if you do all the right things. So the fact that we go down the pathway that we do in the traditional medical system, now that I know what I know, is absolutely mind-boggling. And it just feels like a trap for patients that are headed down this pathway with bone health issues. So
Right.
now I'm on a mission to help educate, to get on podcasts, to create content for the YouTube channel, to basically eradicate this disease from the world, because it is a worldwide problem and nobody has the solution except for our team, from what I can tell. Because you have to do the right things, and the wrong messaging is out there and it's abundant. So me and my team now, we've built a team around this, are on a mission to help educate people. So now, Optimal Human Health, we're not going to change the name, but we only talk about bone health. We only offer the Optimal Bone Health program within that, and a couple of different ways to do it. We also have a community around bone health. We're growing this thing worldwide. So now the practice has a mission. Now we can really serve people. And the team has grown as a result of that. And over the last couple of years, it has totally changed. It's a totally different beast now than it was when we started.
I love that, man. I love that mission. Why do you think osteoporosis is so prevalent? And from the research that I did, kind of in preparation for our conversation, it seems like it's increasing actually.
It is.
Um, why? What's going on?
Yeah. So I this is part of like the bigger picture of how we've changed as a population. So
Yeah.
our population of humans now is less active than ever. Our food is more highly processed than ever. You could get into the weeds of like, oh, our calories are coming from seed oils, or like blah blah blah. But big picture
Right.
is We're consuming more highly processed food. We are not, you don't even want to call it exercising. We're not moving. There's no impact. We don't stress ourselves, right? Like my thermostat is set to be balanced between 72 and 74 degrees. My system is never stressed if I'm in my house, right? So our bodies are losing the input that it needs to maintain certain systems for sure. And you can see this in the immune system. You can see it with cardiovascular disease and dementia. Like all of this is on the rise, but the underpinnings are all the same. And so for the musculoskeletal system, in order to maintain muscle, in order to maintain bone, we need certain inputs. We need resistance, literally resistance training. We need impact. We need appropriate nutrition, not necessarily calories. We need appropriate nutrition, appropriate protein, and you have to be consistent. And the fact that we're not doing that as kids means that our kids, as they reach adulthood in their early 20s and 30s, they're going to fail to achieve peak bone mass. And then we know that statistically, everybody's going to lose bone from their early 30s until they die at about 1% to 2% per year. If you don't have a good starting point, you're absolutely screwed and you are going to have osteoporosis unless you do the things that we know will prevent and potentially reverse osteoporosis. It's easy to do. It's actually simple to do, but it's all the inputs that nobody's doing, especially women who are under eating, chronically dieting, not doing resistance training, eating inadequate protein. Like it's such a clear picture for me. And then as all the other things get worse, as autoimmunity gets worse, inflammation goes up, gut health gets worse, stress goes up, all of these things are working against us on the bone health side. So you just see this, it's a perfect picture. It's a perfect equation for developing osteoporosis, and it's going to become a huge problem.
That makes a lot of sense, man. So what do you say to somebody who's like, let's say they're in their like mid 30s, a female in their mid 30s, and they say, well, doc, I want to make sure I don't get osteoporosis because I have it that runs in my family, but I'm also a big, I don't know, social media influencer. I'm on camera a lot. I got to stay skinny. I got to look
Yeah,
good for X, Y, or Z reason. Or just general social pressures that it seems like we have more and more, not just females, but males as well. How do you
totally.
kind of balance that act with these types of patients?
Yeah, so it's an interesting balance. I mean, my own journey is interesting in this regard, which is like I'm very prone genetically to obesity. I'm just an overeater by nature. My dad is 350 pounds. He's all of 5'7". My mom has been struggling her whole life, and my sister is obese as well. So like I have that propensity. So I get that we in this state, chronic dieting is a real thing, right? Like people probably don't expect me to be like a bathing suit model, and I don't need to be that for my profession. I get that, but I see myself on camera. So I'm my own biggest critic, right? So I feel that pressure absolutely. And I see it in our patients, especially in our women patients, but you're right, men see it too. And when people on board, we have them track their food. And they the amount of under eating, undernourishment is just insane. I mean, people that are eating like 600 calories, 800 calories a day,
Whoa.
and they're like, man, I don't understand why I can't build muscle. I'm like, I don't understand how you're alive, right? The body is amazing that it can accommodate to such low levels of nutritional intake, because this is probably not good food either, right? It's like
Sure.
800 calories of garbage. And so it's amazing that the body can even do this. And so we have to then do the work. And this is why a lot of our team are dietitians and coaches. You have to do the work to really change not only habits, but the mindset. And
Right.
this is something I've done too. So when I first started tracking calories, I was probably 1400, 1600, 1800 most days, right? And inadequate protein, just trying to stay lean. And I
Right.
never really liked my body composition. I couldn't put on muscle mass. I was just like,
Yeah.
like this sucks. And I know a lot of my female patients and probably male patients can sympathize with that. And so what changed for me and the way that we now treat our patients is that, look, if we go protein forward, you're
Yeah.
not going to put on much weight, if any. And if you do put on weight, we're going to monitor your body composition as you go. So if you look at women, especially you look at these journeys of kind of some of the like fitness influencers, the more
Yeah.
muscle a woman has, the better her shape is, in my opinion.
Mm.
This becomes subjective to some extent. But the more muscular, I think the better they look, the healthier they look, the more shapely they look. And they're worried about, I hear all the time, I don't want to get too big. I say, prove me wrong here, but you're not going to get too big, right? You're not going
Sure.
to accidentally grow biceps that are bigger than mine. So we have to change that focus, increase
Yeah.
protein, increase calories, potentially increase output. But for the most part, we can change that basal metabolic rate with the right type of exercise, and then their body comp improves. They're eating more
Yeah.
calories, they're getting more nutrients, and then it all kind of starts to work. The adrenal fatigue gets better, the brain fog gets better, the sleep gets better, because the body's just been running on empty for too long. So you really have to flip that switch and start
Yeah.
consuming better food. It's the big part.
It makes a ton of sense, man. And I don't think that modern medicine does us any favors. And what I mean by that is like, and you know this, the recommended daily allowance of protein for males and females is what, point eight to 1 milligram gram per kilogram.
Kilogram.
But that's crazy because if you look at how we age, when we age, we naturally, as you know, kind of tend towards muscle wasting and really
Absolutely.
losing muscle mass. So, things that I've read at least is we really should be consuming more like 1 gram per pound, which turns
Yeah.
out to be about 2.2 um, grams per kilogram. So, like, what do you think about that? Is there validity to that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is one of the first things we had to figure out, because people come in, and especially in the bone health space, there's such an interest in like the alkalinity, or the alkalinity of your
Yeah.
pH and the impact of food on the alkalinity of your body, which is it's a whole another topic. I have
Yeah.
multiple videos on that. It's pretty much all garbage, but this is very robust. I would call it, bad information. I hate the word misinformation. It's just bad information.
Okay.
And so we see people coming in, they're like, oh, I don't want to eat animal protein because it's going to make my blood acidic and eat my bones. So that's one of the first things I did is I was like, all right, surely there's studies on this. So, you dig into the literature and you see that it is absolutely linear that the more protein you eat, the better your bone mineral density and the lower your fracture risk. Absolutely clear. So
Got
it
it.
just blows the pH theory apart. And then you look at the literature on muscle building, and you clearly see that the sweet spot is probably around 2 to 3 grams per kilogram, or 1 to 1.5 grams per pound of ideal body weight. Most of my audience is not obese or overweight. So we're dealing with people that are actually underweight for the most part. So we're
Mhm.
actually moving that number up, right? So for my 5'5", 95-pound, 60-year-old, I'm saying, look, you need to be eating 100 to 120 grams of protein. And they look at me like I'm nuts, because
Mhm.
they can't do it. They're eating 30 grams a day, probably max. So then we
Yeah.
have to say, okay, well, where are you starting? Let's start here. Let's figure out how to add this in. And that's why our program is a year long, extensive dietitian support. Like it takes time to take
Yeah.
these, especially these women who are very small, have very small appetites. How do you get them eating adequate protein to build muscle and bone? It is step number one. So yeah, I think there's not only data to support that is safe, we have safety data up to, in humans, 3 grams per pound. That's a lot of
Okay.
protein. We have safety data in animals up to 10 grams per pound, right?
Wow.
Like
Wow.
imagine that. So like people say, well, what about my kidneys? I'm like, that if you have good function, you do not need to worry. You will not eat enough protein to damage your kidneys. It's almost impossible. I'm not going to say it is impossible. It's almost impossible. For me, I'm a 200-pound, 6-foot tall guy. If I were to try to eat, what is that, gram per pound, right? 600 grams of
Right.
protein. That's a lot of protein.
A lot of protein, man.
Yeah. So I personally went from eating probably 80 to 100, maybe 120 a day to now, my goal is usually 240 to 300 grams of protein a day, trying to put
Wow.
on muscle mass, which I'm 46 now. As a 46-year-old, my body composition's better than it's ever been. I have more muscle than I've ever had. I'm stronger than I've ever been. And as I
Got
said, I was a professional ballet dancer. I was a
it. Yeah.
professional athlete, right? And I'm actually leaner now than I was then.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. So speaking of protein, let's say somebody in your program is like, okay, well, I need to increase my protein by 20%, whatever the case may be. Is there a difference between just slamming protein shakes all day versus eating actual food like lean meats, et cetera, for that protein? Or if somebody's vegetarian, like how does
Mm.
vegetarian protein compare to, we'll call it natural protein like meat versus just protein shakes? Is there a difference?
Yeah. So great questions. And this is a challenge that we deal with out of the gate with just about every patient. Because again, they're worried about pH. So we'll have that conversation. And then they're worried
Yeah.
about like, well, if I don't want to change the way that I eat because what I eat is my belief system, can I just use this protein shake or this bar or this whatever? So let me talk about vegetarian versus animal sources of meat, or plant versus animal sources of protein is a better way to say that. So when you look from a pH perspective, for anybody listening who is in the osteoporosis space, who's like, well, I'll just eat plant protein because it's not going to change my pH. It's the protein, it's the amino acids that make the difference. So there's actually no difference really from a pH perspective if it comes from a plant or comes from an animal. So just erase that out of the gate. When it comes to the quality of the protein, this absolutely matters too. So the challenge around anything other than animal protein is, what is the composition of essential amino acids in it? So if you look at an animal and the meat from an animal, it's going to have the same essential amino acids that we need to consume. It's because we are the same operating system. If you've heard Paul Saladino kind of give that analogy, right? Like, we have the same operating system as other animals. Plants have a different operating system. Yes, there are proteins available in plants, but the amino acid composition is different. So you have to then mix and match most plant sources of protein in order to come up with the same amino acids. And so you're limited by whatever the lowest amino acid is in that combination of proteins. There are some complete proteins coming from plants, so soy, pea protein, et cetera. But those proteins come with other potential bad things, and you have to eat a large volume of them, which is probably never a good thing. And then they become obviously highly processed because nobody's out there eating, well, I shouldn't say that. Probably not many people are out there eating enough like edamame as a whole food source of protein to actually get their protein needs, right? Like, that would be very difficult to do. And so we encourage people to eat animal-based protein. And when we say 1 gram per pound as a starting point, we mean of animal protein primarily. And if you're going to use plant protein, we add a variable to that and we say, well, now multiply it by another 0.5, right? You need to get so if we said 1 gram per pound, now it's 1.5 grams per pound. And that'll deter a lot of people when they're like, wait, I thought 100 was hard. Now you're saying 150? Like, how am I going to do that? I'm like, well, you should probably eat some animal protein. And, and then they say, well, what about if I add a pea protein mix, or like this veggie protein, or even if it comes from whey or comes from beef? Like, all of these things are available as powders. The challenge with powders is that when you process anything, we know this from highly processed food and ultra processed food, when you process it, the absorption goes down. So while we do use it as a tool, and I do consume them myself, we add it, gram per gram. I add it to Chronometer, is what we use as an app to track food. I'll add it there and we'll consider it as a protein source, but I always encourage people to use whole food sources instead, because it's going to be absorbed better. It's going to be utilized better. It's going to have a more natural impact on the body. Also more filling. You can really slurp down a lot of calories. So we have people use them, but I would encourage people, if possible, to use whole food sources instead. And then if you're going to use the powders, we encourage people to use either whey. If they can't tolerate whey because of the dairy impact, the protein impact, then hydrolyzed beef is actually becoming more common. One of our biggest affiliates is the company Equip, and they make a great hydrolyzed beef product, which I think is great. So we encourage those two because there's more evidence behind those two than anything else, especially whey, especially in the elderly. Whey has been studied very extensively, and it has a great anabolic impact.
That's amazing. Okay, cool. So now let's say your patient's like, okay, I'm willing to try animal protein. How would you rank animal protein? Like, where would you want them to start, and what would you want them to avoid?
Yeah, this gets into like we get into the belief systems, right? And we get into like all these arguments around animal protein and agriculture, and it becomes such an interesting conversation that I really enjoy having, but I can go off on the deep end and talk about, conspiracy theories and some of the craziness. But it's very clear to me that if you just lump animal protein together, I don't actually have to get too picky if my goal is for you to build muscle and bone. I don't really need to get too picky. But when you start talking about the nutritional impact, what is the micronutrient composition? Like, what is the best source? People ask me that a lot. What is the best source? The best source of animal-based protein is going to be beef. Hands down, it is the cleanest source of protein. It has the most nutrients in it. And if you were to just pick one source, I would say beef all day long. The
Okay.
thing that's really unique about beef, about cows, is that cows are ruminants. So they have multiple stomachs. If an animal has multiple stomachs, they're essentially filtering and purifying whatever they take in through each of that process. They're fermenting it in their gut, right? And then all of the stuff that we worry about that's in the environment essentially gets filtered out. So if you have a grass-fed cow that is grass-fed, grass-finished, lives on the pasture, that is going to be the best nutrient dense meat that you can possibly consume.
Got
You
it.
could argue then, well, gosh, what if they're in the like a traditional agricultural feedlot? Like, is it worse? It is worse. But how much worse? Because they're ruminants, they're going to filter out a lot of the stuff that we're worried about anyway. If they're fed, GMO corn and soy, a lot of that's going to be filtered out. Wouldn't be my first choice, but if I'm traveling and I only have access to, feedlot beef versus whatever other protein source, I'm still going to eat feedlot beef. When you get into other sources like chicken, obviously very popular. The problem with
Yeah.
chicken, and this would be true with pork as well, is that they aren't ruminants. They only have one stomach. Whatever they're eating, you're getting that in their meat. So if they're eating, chickens are fed GMO corn, soy, you're going to get GMO corn, soy, and glyphosate in the meat. So then you have
Good
all these
point.
additional toxins that are added to your system unnecessarily. But there are other potential reasons to choose like a leaner cut of meat or something that doesn't have as much iron in it based off of biomarkers and cardiovascular risk, like all this stuff. So there is nuance to that, but the short answer is beef all day long.
That's good to hear, man. Yeah, because I know people have this impression that beef has is fatty or beef has more fat associated with it, but it sounds like you can really adjust for that as long as you're measuring it and keeping track of what you're taking in. You can really work around that and still maximize the benefits.
Yeah, I mean the biggest challenge around the beef and fat is that beef is always going to be fattier than like chicken breast, right? Like chicken breast is
Sure.
so lean, there's very little fat in it. So like as a bodybuilder trying to keep calories down and maximize protein, like they just eat, chicken breast and rice all day, right?
Right.
The nutrient the nutrient density is different, clearly.
Yeah.
But the problem is when some people consume more dietary fat, when some people consume more saturated fat, their cholesterol goes up. So then we have to get into like okay, well, what is the risk of cholesterol for you? Do you have cardiovascular risk? Is this an issue? Or should we focus more on the nutrient density? And that's a unique decision that has to be made on a case by case basis. But there
Makes
could be
sense.
issues with the saturated fat in red meat versus other leaner cuts of meat like chicken and pork.
Okay, perfect, man. Switching gears a little bit, how do you see hormones kind of playing into osteoporosis as well as health span in general? Like when these
Yeah.
patients are coming to you and they're just, falling apart and they're osteoporotic and they're almost desperate to do something to change the course of their life. How do you begin looking at their hormones? Does it really play into it? Is it overrated? I mean, what do you think about that?
They're super important. I
Yeah.
think, you know, we see I would say our average patient is going to be a relatively early postmenopausal woman, right? So like upper 50s, went through menopause at 50, didn't go on HRT, hormone replacement therapy, because they, didn't have symptoms or they were told it was too risky or whatever. This is like the classic example, the classic case, because we know that estradiol specifically as the most potent estrogen, estradiol is very closely related to bone metabolism. Progesterone plays a role in bone metabolism. Testosterone plays a role in bone metabolism. When you lose the estradiol and progesterone precipitously at menopause, you will predictably lose a significant amount of bone over the next 5 to 10 years.
Got
So
it.
the fact that we don't screen before menopause is like just mind blowing. But we don't. So then women won't get screened until they're, 60 or maybe 65 if they follow the actual guidelines. And then they've already lost all that bone. So we can see there's such a powerful impact there. When I started looking at hormones, I recognized too, if you look at the literature, man, go back for premenopausal women in their 20s and 30s, if they have dysfunctional hormones, if they have dysfunctional, let's say they're, not ovulating for whatever reason, if they're not ovulating, they're not making progesterone, they're losing bone in their 20s and 30s. If
Hmm.
they're on birth control that prevents them from ovulating, they're losing bone. I'm going to say that again.
Wow.
If they're on birth control that prevents them from ovulating, they're losing bone because they don't have enough progesterone. The progestins in the birth control actually cause bone loss themselves. So that, again, a population of women that is going to absolutely have issues with their bone health in the future, and they're not being fed this information. The Instagram algorithm is not feeding it to them,
Yeah.
so they don't know. They're not hearing this message. So we know hormones are absolutely important when it comes to bone health. We use them a lot in the treatment if we can. But again, our population is older. We have patients, I said, our average patient probably upper 50s. We have patients in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. The further away you get from menopause, the more risky potentially it could be to add that in. I am relatively bullish as far as adding it, even for our women in their 60s and 70s, and even potentially 80s, 30 years out from menopause, if all of the risk factors line up. But the further you get out from menopause, the less likely that's going to be. So we know based off of the data that we're collecting, because we're looking at what are the interventions that we're using, how successful are people in the program, and we can see very clearly that if you use hormone plus minus as an intervention, as an individual intervention, you can see that there is a clear difference in the success rate, whether it comes to bone turnover markers or imaging. So we know in our own patient population, HRT is a very, very big tool, and the research supports it as well.
That's incredible, man. So when should a patient start looking at HRT as an option, or even just measuring their hormones? I mean, at what
Yeah.
age do you think that's appropriate?
So we actually started a second company because this is such a big issue. Because doctors aren't trained to test hormones in premenopausal women unless
Yeah.
there's issues with infertility. In perimenopausal women, most doctors are trained to not test hormones because they're going to be all over the place, right? Like, well, we don't want to test it because they're going to be unpredictable. Well, I would argue that's actually why you should test it, because they're unpredictable and we need to try to get a sense of what's happening. It's not necessarily easy, and one test might not be the answer, but I would rather test and know and make some decisions based off of that than not. So for us, for premenopausal women that are cycling regularly, I think
Yeah.
it's good to get a sense of what estrogen and progesterone levels are. For anyone, honestly.
Okay.
Even if you're cycling regularly, no symptoms, no PMS, no PMDD, assuming that you're ovulating, right? Like, let's see what your levels are, because as things change, if you know that you have very high levels of estrogen as a woman, if progesterone becomes dysfunctional, then you know what the treatment is, right? You know where to go with that.
Right.
I just had a patient 2 days ago. She's perimenopausal, but estrogen levels, what would be considered very high, in the 500s at the peak of her follicular phase.
Wow.
Her progesterone levels are not terrible, but they're not high enough, and she's very symptomatic, right? And so it's helpful for us to say, look, you would probably benefit from some progesterone support because you have inadequate progesterone in your luteal phase to counterbalance the estrogen that you're making naturally. And this is going to be, for women that are going through perimenopause, this is really common. And then
Got it.
also you get potential androgen deficiency as well. So low testosterone can really make all of that worse too. So I recommend, if you're having any symptoms whatsoever, PMS, PMDD, you not ovulating, infertility, like, you want to know what's happening. And then absolutely postmenopausal women should know where they are from a testosterone perspective. Um, the system doesn't shut down completely in postmenopausal women, but they're never going to have adequate estradiol and progesterone without support. So while I still test that population even before we start, the results are relatively predictable, but I still think it's a really great starting point to the conversation.
Got it. So, in respect to timing of testing, I mean, I guess number one, is it just a simple blood test that you recommend, just a one-time test? And then two, when along, let's say a premenopausal woman, when along their cycle should you test that?
Yeah. So we use blood primarily. Serum is very predictable. It's the standard of care. It's simple, and
Right.
it's relatively inexpensive. So it is probably the best way to test if you're looking at estradiol, progesterone to some extent, and testosterone levels, both total and free. So it is the easiest thing to do. It's the starting point for our program. Our company is called PEMA Bioidentical, and in that, with that, the way that flow works for patients is that we come in, we have them get a blood test, and then we talk about those results and come up with a plan based off of that. If they're postmenopausal, it doesn't matter when, right? So they're going to be the same throughout the month. For premenopausal women, we will guide them and we'll say, look, whichever of these you're closest to, let's start with this one, and then we might need to get the other one. But it's very simply for a woman who's on a 28-day cycle, days 12 and days 21, so the same numbers, just flip them around, right? Days 12, day 21. Day 12 is generally going to be your follicular peak. Day 21 is generally going to be your luteal phase peak of progesterone. So it's a good starting point, but not all women fit that cycle map. And so sometimes we have to make some adjustments based off of that. We generally will start there and use blood. If we have concerns about estrogen detox, like this patient that I saw a couple of days ago, estrogen detox, the way that she's metabolizing her estrogen is a big part of this because she has limited progesterone, a whole lot of estrogen, and she's very symptomatic. So, what do her detox pathways look like? And the way that you would do that is through urine testing. So the Dutch test is Dutch is a company that does that very well. There's some others out there. But using a Dutch test to help looking at urine metabolites of estrogen detox can be really helpful in deciding how to treat this patient. Saliva is another way to test. I don't use it personally. There's some big advocates for it out there, but I think you can't use it alone. You have to use it in conjunction with other things. We currently just don't. It doesn't fit into any of our SOPs, so there just really isn't a role for saliva testing for me. But it's because we're also very conscientious about what we're doing, particularly when we're using things like topical hormones, especially topical progesterone, which you can really only test through saliva. But we don't know enough about what that test means to be able to use it as the sole tool when it comes to identifying whether or not progesterone levels are accurate and adequate. So testing in hormones is tricky. And that's why I think a lot of doctors just avoid it. They're like, we don't need to test. We'll just go off of your symptoms. But if you go off the symptoms, you're going to miss the big picture of HRT.
Yeah, it makes sense. So ideally then day 12 and day 21 as two individual blood tests for
Right.
premenopausal.
Right. And so again, for us, like we don't have them do both before they come in. We have them do one and then we have that conversation. And then if we need to, then we'll do the other one. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't.
Got it. So patient specific. And then as far as replacement is concerned, with I guess all three, testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone, what are the best ways that you have found to actually replace those if indicated? And I guess why?
Yeah. So we are big advocates for replacement. And I had to learn the process of doing it well because my patients just weren't getting served. I would love to. And I've heard doctors that do this. They say, oh, I'm just not going to get into the hormone space because it's too risky. I'm going to get sued, blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm just going to let your OBGYN figure it out. But the problem is that the OBGYN community has really not embraced it. They're saddled with the responsibility. Absolutely. Everybody expects that from their OBGYN. And I don't fault them for this because if you think about what they're trained to do, they're in like one of the craziest subspecialties because they're asked to know everything about obstetrics and then know everything about gynecology and then to also be an endocrinologist to know everything about hormones, right? Like this is insane. Like it should absolutely be at least two different subspecialties, if not three. And so I don't fault OBGYNs for not having a great understanding of hormones because they got a lot of stuff on their plate. And I would never pretend to be a GYN. But when it comes to hormones, there isn't anybody that's doing it really well. So I recognized early on, well, shoot, like we're going to have to manage this. And so I did, you can see it behind me. I wrote a book. It's right there.
Oh, nice.
I wrote a book on it and did a ton of research. I actually wrote the book and then I rewrote it and then I rewrote it again because the research on hormones is very confusing and it's very difficult to follow. And when you follow, especially influencers that have a bias, and we all have a bias, I get it, but they really present one side of the controversial areas within hormones, or they side with the big organizations like ACOG and NAMS who are, recommending guidelines for people with hormone therapy. And it's a very challenging space. So this is where we have come out on the other side, which is I think that most of the risk around hormones are wildly overstated. There's a lot of fear around hormones, and I respect that. I'm not saying that they are without risk, but the risk has to be understood, especially in the face of what somebody is dealing with. And so, for my patients with osteoporosis, they have a thing that is likely going to impact them significantly, potentially even result in their death. So when we're talking about the risk benefit of hormones, it becomes much more obvious that this tiny little risk of whether it be cardiovascular disease, blood clot, or breast cancer, is actually outweighed by the thing that we already know that they have anyway. So we can therefore be a little bit more bullish than most providers because we're dealing with a population that would wildly benefit from hormones and
Yeah.
is at like already has something that we know is likely to kill them if we don't fix it. So we
Makes
can get a
sense.
little bit more aggressive. And so the way that we treat then is we actually start with estradiol and progesterone first. This is for postmenopausal women. We start with those two first rather than testosterone. I'll explain why in a minute. But once you get those two optimized, and there's a couple of different ways to do that, actually a lot of different ways to do that. But once you get those two optimized, what we find is that natural testosterone production, especially if you support it with androgen precursors like DHEA, that natural testosterone production will actually take off because women, even postmenopausal women, can make 75% of their natural testosterone, even the postmenopausal state, because it comes through the adrenals and adrenal precursors. So we can support estradiol progesterone and then not have to worry about testosterone because it actually balances out naturally. And we can see that in our blood tests. For
Mm.
women that still need it afterwards, we can consider it at that point. And I like it. The problem I see with testosterone, especially as women age past 60 and 70, is that the side effect profile goes way up. So while younger women really do tolerate testosterone very well in much higher doses, as our patients get above 60, 70 and beyond, we can't drive their levels up very high or they start complaining about hair loss. And so it's something that you have to balance because that's something that they take very seriously. Women don't like losing hair, and I totally get it. You and I both have a very similar looking head. So like I feel you. And I don't want to do that. And we don't have to lean on testosterone for that. But using topical estradiol, oral progesterone is our starting point because it eliminates the vast majority of the risks that people worry about. And we can really optimize levels that way. So we use topical estradiol then for replacement for women because if you use topical, then you can avoid some of the blood clot and heart attack and stroke risk that you see with oral estradiol in some studies. We use oral progesterone because you can measure that in serum, and we find that it really helps with sleep. It's very tolerable for most women, but not all women. So the combination of those two is usually all we need, potentially with some DHEA support. If we need testosterone, then we can add that. Generally for women, it's easy to do through a cream as well because the dose is relatively low. For men, generally we're doing injections, intramuscular injections for men for testosterone because we need to get higher doses into the muscle to be absorbed.
What are your thoughts on pellet therapy for, I guess, estrogen and testosterone?
Yeah, I'm biased because we run a telehealth practice, so I can't do pellets through Zoom. So we don't go down that pathway. I know some providers that lean on pellets, and they love them, and I think they're really good at them. They start at low doses, they test, and they can be very responsible with pellets. The problem I see with pellets is if you are working with somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, or it kind of has an irresponsible practice and just shoves in big doses,
Yeah.
boy, you could be on a really terrible ride because you can't
Yeah.
get it out. And so you're going to be on a 3-month ride. And for women, I've seen them come in literally with just hair falling out in bunches, feeling terrible, like can't sleep, and they can't change it. And they
Mm.
are miserable and scared. So I don't like pellets for that reason. But again, I'm biased because I see people coming to me that have had a bad experience on pellets.
Makes
And I
sense.
know providers that love pellets. So my personal opinion is let's use something we can adjust the dosage of daily versus something where you're just stuck with it and the absorption dynamics could be different. Like it just is, I think there's a lot of room for error there.
Yeah.
I understand it's convenient. That's probably the biggest reason why people would want to do it is like, hey, I just go in, I get this procedure every quarter and I'm done. That
Right.
does sound nice. But
Right.
for
Right.
me, the risk isn't worth it.
I got you. The hair loss. Let's say somebody comes to you and they're losing hair because they had somebody give them too much testosterone in a pellet therapy. Is that reversible?
Yeah, sometimes yes, sometimes no. So
Mm.
I haven't seen this in my patients, thankfully, because we start low, go slow, and when we start to
Right.
see symptoms, we back off, right? So we have a great feedback loop with our patients. But especially pellet therapy, you're on that ride, hair comes out in chunks,
Oof.
especially with testosterone around the temporal area, so kind of like
Mhm.
above your ears.
Yeah.
Uh, that hair is reported not to grow back in women. So this again is like, I want to be very cautious here because that would be terrible for someone. They would hate
Totally.
the way that they looked if they lost all that temporal hair. So yeah,
Sure.
it potentially could not come back.
Oof. And you see that with men and women, the same kind of issue of.
I don't see it in men as much. When men are complaining about hair loss, it's more of the androgenic all over their head hair loss, right? It's a different
Right.
pattern.
Right.
And that probably is more reversible because you're gonna have some different tools, right? So like the DHT blocking, topical minoxidil, finasteride, et cetera. Like you have tools for that. I don't necessarily love them all. Um, but we don't see the same issues of it not growing back in men because it kind of presents differently.
Right. Can you use those tools with women if they're losing their
You
hair?
you can, yeah. I wouldn't use the oral versions, but you can absolutely use the topical, and we do that for some women. My goal though is not to give you a dose of a hormone that has so much of a side effect that you need a
Right.
something to use chronically
Yeah.
for the rest of your life to counter that.
Totally.
Like I don't want to
Totally.
do that.
Totally.
And there's some doctors too that'll use high doses of testosterone, but then they'll also use spironolactone, and
Yeah.
it like balances it out, but then like you're just sort of like negating what you're doing systemically. So I just prefer to let's dial in the dose, and then hopefully you won't need anything for the side effects, and we're pretty good about that. We don't have anybody on like chronic minoxidil or any other drugs for
Yeah.
side effects of hormones.
It makes a lot of sense, man. Otherwise, you're just robbing Peter to pay Paul. Like, what are we really doing here?
Right, right.
All right, great. So it sounds like ideally for the female population, then start with estrogen and progesterone first. Testosterone will probably autocorrect it once you get those under control. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like oral replacement is preferred or topical for those two. Pellets, maybe not so much for the reasons we discussed.
Yeah, yeah. And just to clarify one point there, oral
Yeah,
progesterone and topical estradiol are
perfect,
the
perfect.
pathway that we go. Yeah.
And there is oral estrogen available, right?
There is. And the
Yeah,
challenge with oral estrogen is that it metabolizes into byproducts that can potentially be thrombotic. So they can cause blood clots. Not all of the literature supports that an oral estrogen will increase the risk of blood clot, but there's enough signal there that I would stay away from it.
okay, okay, got you. Now I know osteoporosis. When we hear that word, we think older female population. What do you see with the male population in osteoporosis? Is that becoming more of a problem?
It is absolutely, and it's for all the same reasons. It just looks a little bit different, right? And while women have a clear sign that something is wrong with their hormones because they'll
Yeah,
have issues with PMS, PMDD, they'll have ovulatory dysfunction,
yeah,
symptomatic from estrogen. Men don't have that. So if men have low testosterone, a lot of times it's either missed, it's misdiagnosed, it's called something else. Your anxiety is because of blah blah blah. Low testosterone is rampant in young men. And if you have low testosterone, you're going to have low estradiol. So for men, the only estrogen we make comes from our testosterone at any
mm,
appreciable level. And so if you have low estrogen as a man, you are going to have bone loss. And we see this in young men, not all the time because they're not listening to our content. But
right.
I see men in their 50s relatively frequently that have osteoporosis. I had a professional runner actually in the UK who was he reached out to me on Instagram, and he had osteoporosis. He's in his 20s, and obviously there's other factors there. I think it's probably a lot more prominent than we know, or prevalent. Better word there.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes me think about when you do TRT on a male, for example, a lot of times these men will use like a Remedex or aromatase inhibitors or something like
Hmm.
DIM. I wonder if that ever really kind of drops estrogen to a point where it becomes
Absolutely.
problematic. You do
Yeah.
see
So if
that.
if you're using big doses, so there's
Yeah.
there's a lot of there's a lot of different ways to do this, and I've worked with some guys in the TRT space. I've been on TRT myself, and so I've gone down this pathway. And when you look at some providers' protocols, they'll use big doses, 1 milligram more of an AI, an anastrozole, like daily. And if you're using that much anastrozole, your estradiol levels are zero. I mean, just shuts it down. And that is dangerous. Absolutely. So you'll have great testosterone, you'll have no estrogen, you'll put on muscle like crazy,
Hmm.
um, but you're losing bone. And so, yeah, we see one of my coach, Allie Gilbert, who you might know,
Yeah.
she deals with a lot of guys that are on TRT. She works with a company that helps people to get access, and she says that company doesn't do it, but she sees these guys come in and they're huge, right? They're bodybuilders, they're strength training, they're massive,
Yeah.
and they have osteoporosis because they've been blocking estrogen for years.
That's wild. That's
Mm-hmm.
wild. So those types of guys, I mean, obviously stop the arimidex or stop the dim, but is that can you come back from that?
Yeah, I mean, we show that you can build bone almost
Yeah,
regardless of age, up to a point. So we've got 80-year-olds that are improving their DEXA. Like, it's amazing what the body can still do.
yeah,
The younger you are, the faster it happens. So if you got a guy who's in his 30s, like this runner in the UK, he changed his diet, changed the way that he trained, and he started reversing osteoporosis in 6 months. And like, he never worked with us
incredible.
because we can't see patients across international
Yeah,
borders. But we put so much content out there that
yeah,
he just put it together. He asked me questions on Instagram, and he created a program, and he's doing great. So, like, as a 30-year-old guy, it should be pretty easy to do because you can do the impact, you can do the
right.
resistance training, you can change your diet, you can get the protein, your gut's probably still working well. And you can put all the pieces together pretty easily. If you're 80, it's a lot harder and slower. And so we get
Yeah.
some frustrated women in their 70s who are like, like, my bone mineral density only went up by 4%. I'm like, well,
Mm.
that's a huge win, But we share these stories of women in their 50s where it goes up by 10%, 20%, 25%, right? Like,
Wow.
these massive improvements. And so I get it. They're like, oh, I was hoping it'd be more. I'm like, look, you didn't lose bone, so that's a win by itself. And the fact that you gained more than what is like the margin of error in a DEXA, like, this is such a huge win. You should really celebrate that. So yeah, it is possible almost regardless of age, as long as you have the capacity to do the things we got to do.
That's a huge point that you just made, which is like, we're in the process of losing bone and losing muscle at baseline. So if you're not actively fighting that, you're going to lose no matter what. You're going to move towards like sarcoidosis and, the entropy will kick in. So yeah, if you're even staying the same as you age, it sounds like that's actually kind of a win.
It is a win. And we've had patients where they've, like, they get repeat DEXAs and they're like, it's no different. And I'm like, look, you're in your 70s, you're not
Yeah,
on HRT because it was too risky for you, and you didn't lose
yeah,
bone over the course of a year. That is a win. It
definitely.
absolutely is a win. So, hopefully we can push them in the other direction. Like, we can get it forward. It's just going to take more time. Going to need more tools, more effort. I totally support them in that. I understand why they're frustrated, but yeah, to not lose bone is actually a win.
Sweet. Good. That's good. That's a very good point. DEXA, is that really the gold standard for measuring this kind of stuff, bone density?
Ugh. It's the gold standard. Yes, it is not a great test. It has a large margin of error. Some would say plus or minus 4%. Some would say plus or minus 6%. But when you're dealing with something that changes slowly, like we were just saying, losing 1 to 2% per year, if you're on a bone drug, you're hoping to gain 2 to 4%. Everything I just said is within the margin of error, right? So, like,
Great.
this is a crappy test. So there's some new technology that's out there that
Yeah.
is becoming more prominent. I'm involved on an international scale to help to get this technology really unified and linked so that we can add some education to it and really make it a great way to not only get your bone density and quality checked, which DEXA doesn't do, understanding fracture risk, and then understanding what you can do then to help move your body, move your system forward in a way that can actually help to reverse that bone loss without even needing to, like, join a program like mine. Because again, this is a worldwide problem, and this is something that we
Yeah.
should be able to squash.
I mean, this is huge, Doug, because this is what I'm really hearing from you overall is like you don't need to be on pharmacological medications forever to really kind of combat this. There are ways where lifestyle changes and everything you're discussing, you can fix this almost naturally and stay away from, big pharma, frankly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so people call me out on this all the time. They're like, but wait, you said that you prescribe HRT, aren't those drugs? Yes. So yeah, when I say naturally, I'm including hormone replacement therapy.
Yeah.
You can do it without, it's just slower. And so
Yeah.
we definitely see that. But yeah, I think that the bone health drug industry, it is hard not to look at the way that we hold off on screening and then recommend drugs indefinitely as a trap, right?
Right.
Like, it just feels like a trap. And I understand, you can make an argument from a public health perspective. I get it, but it is a trap. So yeah, most people don't need the drugs. The fact that the recommendation for even like a 50-year-old woman that's screened early, maybe because of a family history or whatever, has osteoporosis and then is told to take this anti-resorptive drug that has some pretty nasty side effects, pretty nasty risks, and she can only take it for 3 to 5 years. She's 50. Her lifespan expectancy is another 35 years. What are you going to do over the
Totally.
next 35 years. You can't take these drugs that long. So shouldn't we start to do something natural first? Shouldn't we say, hey, now you have a reason to be on HRT. Hey, now you have a reason to do resistance training and impact training and sleep better and reduce your stress and improve your diet and improve your gut health, right? Like
Yeah.
that should be the conversation, but that's not the conversation. The
Yeah.
conversation is, your DEXA score is -2.7. Here's your script for Fosamax. I'll see you in a year. And that's it.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy, man. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Speaking of lifestyle, some other thoughts that come into my mind about lifestyle issues, like, what about things like alcohol or cannabis? I mean, do these play into
Hmm.
osteoporosis at all?
Yeah, cannabis, not enough data yet. I've seen some
Okay.
associations, but like I don't think there's enough data to even talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, alcohol is this is one of those things like quote unquote moderate alcohol consumption is positively associated with an improvement in bone density. Like I think that the data around alcohol probably is a little biased towards the alcohol industry. So I don't think it's helping your bone. And there's some studies that say that. I think that we have to consider that alcohol is bad for your gut. Alcohol is inflammatory. Alcohol is not going to support exercising and doing impact and eating better. So from my perspective, there's really not a role for alcohol when it comes to health optimization in
Yeah.
general. As somebody who has I stopped drinking, 3.5 years ago, I used to drink wine regularly. As somebody who stopped drinking 3.5 years ago, I can say that it is so much better on the other side of even moderate alcohol consumption. So that's what I recommend to my patients. But we don't talk about it a lot because
Yeah.
most of our patients aren't abusing alcohol. They're consuming
Mhm.
maybe a glass or two, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. Right. And if
Yeah.
that's the thing that helps you to relax and you love that and you're like a wine connoisseur and you want to do that, man, I'm not going to rob you of that. Um, but if somebody's abusing alcohol, if somebody's out there like hammering down shots, like, yeah, that's not going to help your bone so,
Yeah.
or going
Yeah.
to help
Yeah.
anything. Right. So
Totally.
it's something we just don't actually talk a lot about because it's not
Yeah.
really an issue in our patient population.
Yeah, that's great, man. But I totally agree with you. I mean, in general, in the general scope of what we're doing here, if you're moving towards the direction of optimization, alcohol really is going to just slow you down. There's no upside whatsoever.
There's no upside, right? No upside whatsoever.
Yeah, I completely echo that sentiment. Doug, this has been a great conversation, man. I want to just kind of end with a question that I ask all my guests at the very end of our conversations, and that is this: with my practice and with what we do on the show, we really focus on rituals and routines to
Mm.
provide and promote resilience. So, if you could go back to your 20-year-old self, what rituals or routines would you give yourself to do or maybe not do to move towards resilience?
Wow. That's a great question. Um, Boy, if I think of all the things that I could have done to help prevent me from doing some of the stupid things I did between the ages of 20 and 46, that's a long, long list. Um, I
You and I
I
both.
think that yeah, I think the things that would have been most impactful for me would have been to respect sleep. I and all of us did through training, right? Like we're just taught like we don't need it. Like
Yeah,
if you're tired and you're post call, like suck it up.
yeah,
um but even as a 20-year-old, even in college, I mean, I just loved staying up late. I just love, like, it's almost like the cortisol burn was like a something I was chasing for a dopamine. Like it was really interesting. So I definitely abused sleep for a long time. I think also like um not having a good understanding of the power of physical activity. Even though I was active, I didn't do a good job as a young adult of focusing on doing resistance training and focusing on eating good food. I think, like if you want to break that down into rituals, I would say like getting 8+ hours of sleep a night, making it a priority. I would say doing resistance training, at least 3 days a week, true high intensity resistance training, 3 days a week, regardless of whatever activity I was doing in addition to that. And then eating whole foods, getting away from ultra processed stuff. I was raised on, SnackWell cookies and fat free ice cream. And it just it just wrecked me metabolically. And it's been something
yeah,
I've had to chase ever since. So eating whole food meals, and avoiding snacking and not eating late night, like those three things, man, I would have felt so much better through the course
yeah.
of my adult life.
Game changers, man. And I'm a father as
Yeah.
well, but so we're blessed in the sense that we get to, kind of share that with the next generation. So that's the gift that we get to pass on.
Yeah, absolutely. And boy, my kids, they call it mentoring moments. They're like, "Oh, I got another MM from my dad, and
I
another
love that.
mentoring moment." And
I
when I
love that.
talk about those things, yeah, it's
I'm gonna
funny.
steal that one. I'm gonna steal that one. Yeah. What's next for the great Dr. Doug? What do we have to look forward to?
Yeah, I'm really excited about continuing to grow the Optimal Human Health Program. Just dialing that in, doing the research. I'm excited about where that's going to go. But I think bigger picture for me is I love the hormone company we started. I think we're going to do a lot of good there. I love our community called the Osteo Collective for bone health. I think that is really where I want to spend a lot of time and energy and effort
Okay.
because this is something like we've struggled with this international problem where our YouTube channel has a pretty strong international following. Like we have a big audience in Australia, in the UK, and other European countries, and in Canada. And we can't practice medicine, obviously, across international borders. Very difficult. So what we've done is to say, well, we have this community, like we can accommodate this. We're not treating them as patients, so we don't have to worry about that. But we can still support, we can educate, and we can provide a space where people can basically DIY it, right? So I'm almost like robbing from my medical practice, but I want people to do this. You have to recognize there's hundreds of millions of people with osteoporosis in the world. Like
Yeah.
this is a massive problem. And so building up that and working with, like I've got a team that I'm working with in the UK to create content around something for the REMS, which we didn't really mention by name, but this is the other screening method. Creating content for education after you get a REMS in the UK is a big thing that we're doing right now.
Yeah.
I've got a guy in Australia that I'm working with who's doing something similar. There is a way that we can take this community that we've created, which is helping people to DIY their bone health,
Yeah.
to the world. And it could be absolutely massive. It could be such a huge, impactful program for people that everybody could have access to for a very inexpensive monthly fee that could give them incredible value. So I'm super excited about that and where I want to spend some time creating content and relationships and connections.
I love that, man. Where can my viewers find out more about you? Social media handles, etc. Where would you like them to go?
Yeah, if bone health is your concern, or you like want to learn about bone health for a family member, YouTube is the place. We have the Dr. Doug Show on YouTube, and it is all about bone health and hormones. And so that's the Dr. Doug Show. If you just look up Doug Lucas or the Dr. Doug Show on YouTube, you'll find it. Instagram is where we are spending more and more time and effort in growing that channel. And that's just my name, Dr. Doug Lucas. There's some underscores in there somewhere, but search that, you'll find it. Same on Facebook, similar content. And then if you want to learn about our program, our actual bone health program, that's optimalhumanhealth.com.
Perfect.
And then the hormone company is pemabioidentical.com. We mostly market that to women. We serve both women and men. I would imagine your audience is probably more men. If you're looking for TRT, you definitely could reach out to us and we can see if we can serve you. Telehealth TRT it's getting limited in some states. So we would just let you know if it's an option based on the state that you're in. Women, we can service anyone, anywhere. We're licensed in all 50 states. So yeah, anybody in the US could potentially be a patient of Pema Bioidentical.
That's great, man. And I will link to all of those links that you discussed in the show notes of this episode for sure.
Thanks.
Doug, thank you, man. This has been great.